if you'd like to participate, just come on in and let me know. So I'm going to screen share to this. At this point, you should be able to see a PowerPoint.
Yes, I can see it.
Yeah.
Great, great, great. And so I'm going to bring us into the Roman period. And so I'm going to go back to what we kind of already know and talk about the legacy of Greek and Roman literature, or it's all Greek and Roman to me. It's all Greek to me. I have here just on this first slide, a quote from Edgar Allan Poe, very famous, about the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. And something by Alfred North Whitehead, a kind of a statement that all Western philosophy consists of footnotes to Plato, suggesting that Plato basically is the foundation and had written everything that needs to be written about philosophy and society that was ever needed. Probably an overstatement. Greek and Roman contributions to contemporary culture. In part, this is review. You already wrote about some of this. You're already aware of how much of our contemporary Western culture has been influenced by the Greeks and by the Romans. Well, we're learning about the Romans right now. The philosophy, physics, chemistry, mathematics, music. And when we talked about how these even developed from magic and ritual and pageant, rhetoric, that is the effective and persuasive use of language. Oratory, speech making, argumentation, persuasion, those things. Medicine, law, civil administration, engineering, city planning, mainly Roman here, architecture, roads and aqueducts, and of course, what we're going to go into right now, literature. So if I were to reduce what we've really all talked about in terms of Greece and now of Rome, what the basic legacy, what has been given to us from these great writers, is this notion of humanism. A focus, as we've discussed many times, on the human being, interaction with other human beings in a social setting, the emotions, the universality of those emotions, and how they affect behavior and our social conduct, things of that nature. Excuse me. Humanism, as we've defined before, rationalistic outlook or system of thought that attaches prime importance to the human rather than to the divine or supernatural matters. Now, we recognize that in the literature of Greece, there are the gods who interact, and they are major characters within those stories. But you'll also note that those gods are anthropomorphized. In other words, they are rendered with human emotions and human qualities and human thought processes and whatnot. So even though we do have divine and supernatural matters involved, generally it's on a human scale. In the Renaissance, humanism is going to be reborn or rediscovered, and that's one other aspect of it. It's a matter of philosophy. You can read all this on your own, and I will include this PowerPoint onto the Canvas assignment so that you can peruse it at your leisure. You remember her, Sappho. And one thing that I wanted to connect here, and something that you might want to actually do for your assignment on this Roman literary legacy, is not only discuss that Roman author and demonstrate how it is a legacy to our contemporary times and what their signature themes are, and the reason we still read them is because they are universal, still relevant to our times. You might want to compare it to a contemporary poet. So if you recall when you wrote on this poem by Sappho, where she's really upset that the one she loves is parting, and she wants her to remember all those wonderful times that they had together with this luxuriousness surrounding them, and the passion that she brought out so long ago that, of course, is a part of our contemporary feeling and experience. You guys made that point. To something like by Emily Dickinson, who writes here in this brief poem, wild nights were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart and port, done with the compass, done with the chart, rowing in Eden, the sea, but might I but more tonight in thee. If I'm not mistaken, we actually discussed this. And again, in a late 19th century poem by the American poet Emily Dickinson, so much like the passion that was felt thousands of years before. Here again, one's passion drives them beyond reason, desiring that individual that is absent. These are the themes of yearning. These are the themes of an aspect of love. So the poem is about love and passion, but it's also suggesting something about that, and that would be the theme. So rowing in Eden, to this metaphor of being out at sea, tossed around without any kind of navigation. Love is like that. The winds can't help you guide you. When you are in port and your lover is out at sea, the compass can't help you, the chart can't help you, but if you could connect, if that person could come back, rowing in Eden, the sea, that moment of connection is like paradise. If I could only dock, again, the metaphor of the sea and boats, with you tonight. That same kind of an emotion rendered again, the legacy of Sappho registered here in Emily Dickinson. And Sappho not only influenced Dickinson, and this is the idea of here's a Greek writer, archaic Greek writer, who is influencing contemporary writers and throughout history up to our point. I want to see that kind of with the Roman writers. So here are all the different writers that somebody like Sappho has influenced, from Shakespeare and Jane Austen to Dickinson, as we've mentioned, to Maya Angelou and others, to Sylvia Plath. Basically, the literary legacy, you've kind of looked at some of the Greek ones. Homer, Hesiod, who wrote the Theogony, if you recall, in one of the lectures. This was the earliest kind of compilation of the myths that you all know, the Olympian gods, Apollo with Daphne, all those things, the Theogony, and it will greatly influence Ovid here in his work called the Metamorphosis, which means transformation. And in that work, that Roman work, he is looking at these Greek myths and kind of rewriting them to some degree in Roman fashion. It's interesting sometimes to make a comparison between Hesiod's Greek myths and the Ovid's myths and their focus. And one should understand at this point, I think, that in many ways the Romans looked at the Greeks and felt a kind of inferiority complex with them. They believed that the Greeks were the most philosophical, the most sophisticated, the most intellectual. And therefore that's really one of the reasons why they brought Greek philosophers in, Greek engineers, Greek thinkers into Rome. So they always had this a little bit of an inferiority complex, and then decided that they needed to copy those Greek ideas and themes and concepts and stories and whatnot. So Ovid is looking back to Hesiod, the Greek, and saying, wow, these are the significant stories. Let me write them for contemporary times. So you had all of these. Here, Plautus is a Roman writer. These are all the Romans. And he is a writer of comedies, very few of which are really around. We have some fragments. I would suggest we have about 2 to 3 complete plays. If you wanted to explore Plautus, what Plautus has done is taken the new comedy, if you recall that assignment as well, by Menander, with the cunning servant or slave, all these character types, domestic comedy. He wrote about that in terms of connection to situation comedies in contemporary times. You could look at Plautus and find out what his themes are, kind of ridiculing class structure and manners and all those things, very contemporary in terms of our comedy today. And then focus on one of his plays like Pot of Gold and say, oh, see how Pot of Gold brings these basic themes out. And then again, connect it, if you wanted to, at the end, to contemporary comedy. Terence, again, a comic poet and playwright as well. You could choose him. I want to focus on a couple of them a little bit more deeply, because and that would be maybe Cicero, Virgil, Horace, and Ovid, just so that, wow, okay, I know a little bit more about those now, so maybe I want to explore those now. But I'm going to jump from these in just a moment here and go to this one, Seneca. And while we don't have much in terms of his playwriting, his tragedies, one thing is true. As we saw the development from the Greek tragedy like Oedipus to the Hellenistic period, which had more turmoil, more violence, more gore, that transitions into Rome. And remember that Rome is also starting to experience this imperial expansion, if you look at his dates. And therefore, there's lots of warfare, there's lots of conquests. As I mentioned in our last lecture, circuses, bread and circuses, circuses, gladiatorial and otherwise, going on in Rome. And so the tragedies and the artwork itself, like the Hellenistic period, takes on a little bit more realism, a little bit more of that visceral gore, and the tragedies have that little bit more bloodthirsty quality to them, a little bit more graphic in descriptions and in action of violence and otherwise. And we give, in a lot of ways, a lot of credit to Seneca, when I'm speaking about here, and his tragedies for this like revenge motif, the revenge tragedy, where some wrong has been done and the individuals want to get that some justice done. And therefore violence is the mode by which they do it. And we see that in a lot of films, certainly, but there is Seneca. So let me just look at the legacy quickly. All these Greeks and Romans influenced all of these authors, from Renaissance authors like Marlowe and Shakespeare to contemporary absurdists like Samuel Beckett, all the way up to the level of something like Neil Simon, a contemporary writer, relatively contemporary, Eugene O'Neill, Arthur Miller, and others. So let me speak about this one, Cicero, for just a moment. And Cicero is an orator. He is a speaker. He is one who tries to persuade, if you will, the public toward a point of view. And the art of persuasion is indeed a skill and an art. Cicero, you can see his dates right here. Remember that Julius Caesar was assassinated 1 year before the death of Cicero. Cicero was a strong advocate for the Republic. He was very much against somebody like Julius Caesar, a general coming in, fearing that Caesar would become king. We've discussed that already, would take on a crown and become a dictator, ending the Republic and beginning an empire. Cicero conspired with the other senators, Brutus included, Cassius, Cato, and others, to assassinate Caesar, which they did in 44 BCE. Now, Cicero himself did not partake in the assassination, but was a strong advocate for it, and after the assassination, a strong speaker trying to persuade the public that the assassination was necessary. Because of his art of rhetoric, his ability with persuasive speech, and the science of political speech, Cicero was able to convince on most occasions, and this one didn't really work out, a public. So he is an orator and a speech maker, and he would be somebody like who would write speeches for politicians today, or politicians who write their own speeches, or anybody who wants to learn the art of persuasion, the art of argument. So Cicero deals with oratory in his writings, if you were to choose something like that, an oratory that we still use today, an argumentative structure that he learned in part from Aristotle. Aristotle wrote the Rhetoric much earlier, and in it kind of outlined how one persuades an audience towards a point of view. Remember, we discussed that he just talked about 3 appeals to an audience in order to persuade them. The first appeal is ethos, the loosely translated ethics of the speaker, the credibility of the speaker. Do they know what they're speaking about? Are they reasonable and rational? Do we like them? Do they seem honest and trustworthy? Those things. The logos, the argument itself, cold, hard, logic, whether it's deduction or induction, which you've already spoken about. Logos is that second appeal. And the third appeal is the pathos, forming words like sympathy. And pathos is an appeal to the audience's emotions. So drawing upon what Aristotle had written, Cicero expands on that to create the art of rhetoric as well. And his rhetoric will be political and meant for politicians often, for the purpose of persuasion. He will deal with the ethics, one's basic conduct in life that is deemed good. And remember, we're going to be moving into an empire, but the state is everything and the people are everything. So a lot of what Cicero is discussing is human beings' relationship to the state and that kind of loyalty. And in that sense, republicanism. Here's a couple of just quotes from Cicero. And remember, if you dealt with Cicero, you're looking at oratory and the public speaking, you might want to connect to a contemporary public speech. Are they Ciceronian or are they not? Are they too much pathos and not enough logic, too much emotion? Is it all bombast? Are there logical fallacies? Meaning it sounds logically valid, but there's something kind of not right about it. It's not really true logic. We can talk a little bit about that, but let me just kind of go back to this for a second. So here's a couple of quotes. He only employs his passion who can make no use of his reason. So when does one in an argument really lose? Is the individual who's screaming and yelling the most, the one who's lost his temper? Does that mean that they're right? Or does that, in a sense, suggest they have no real logical argument? Because their reason can't come up with the argument, the logical argument, why they did this or why they didn't do that. Instead, their passion overrules it. As old as, if you recall, Plato. Reason, spirit, appetite, tripartite, that idea. Cicero's kind of reiterating that Greek idea. He removes the greatest ornament of friendship who takes away from it respect. I think, and friendship and loyalty is a very Roman theme, and you're going to see it in a lot of Roman writers. But the notion of when does one lose a friend? When one no longer respects that friend or is respected by that friend. And I think that if you look at your contemporary relationships, respect is such an important aspect of wanting to be with someone. And one can apply it, of course, not just to friendship, but to love. Once respect is gone, there's no such thing. So a couple of quotes from Cicero, just to show you what his construct is for the argument. If you wanted to look at political speech, if you wanted to look at a speech by Donald Trump, by Obama, by George W. Bush, whatever you wanted to, by Abraham Lincoln, you will start to see and recognize how some of them do follow Cicero and others do not. Certainly our American Declaration of Independence is Ciceronian. It will follow basically this idea and work on that. So I have here just the basic structure for you if you wanted to deal with Cicero. The introduction to the argument, and the focus of it is who you are as the speaker, your credibility. Who am I? Why should I be the one speaking to you? Now, I get to speak to you because I'm the professor of the class and I have those credentials. But how I present myself to you, whether I'm knowledgeable or not, whether I'm a reasonable individual or not, trustworthy, all those things are my ethos. And before I can get you to really start to persuade you to my point of view, I got to persuade you toward me and your willingness to listen to me. The second part of Cicero's argument would be the narration. And the focus of that is it outlines the issues of the argument. This is what the issues are. Whether they're arguments on a death penalty, on abortion, on this, that, or the other. What are the issues that we're going to really be focusing on, and what are we not going to be focusing on? So that's how you start to narrow it down to be able to persuade somebody to your point of view. The next section was division, and that focuses your message. Okay, here's my thesis. So for example, let's say your introduction is going to be about, the use, hi, I'm a medical veterinarian pet owner. And I know a lot about pets and animals, and that's my introduction, my ethos. There's a problem with the use of animals in medical research. I am now giving the narration, and I'll outline the issues. I'll start to talk about the fact that there's too many animals being used for medical research. So I'm going to move now from that subject of medical research, of the use of animals in medical research, to my issue, which is that there's too many being used in medical research. And then I'm going to move to my assertion. We should restrict or ban the use of animals in medical research. That's what Cicero is kind of doing here in his division. You'll note that this first part is ethos focused. The second and the main parts are logos focused, the logic of the argument. The next part is the proof. All right, you say no more use of animals. We want to restrict the use of animals in medical research. What's your proof? What's your evidence? What's your data? What's your specific support that demonstrates that your point of view is the one we should adopt? So these are the major points of your argument. And again, they become the logos. And this is Cicero. After you've given all the major points of your argument why they shouldn't use animals in medical research, you're going to anticipate that people are going to argue against you. You've just made certain points, and they're already thinking, your audience, oh, that was wrong because of this, that was wrong because of that. So before they get a chance to actually argue against you, you're going to refute this next section, and the focus is you're going to address the oppositions. You're going to raise the arguments of the other side in order to demonstrate why they're not correct. And in raising the arguments of the other side, a couple things happen. You demonstrate to an audience that you know both sides of the issue, not just arguing from a vacuum, only your point of view. The way kind of the news is being put out right now, they're only arguing their point of view. By understanding the other side point of view and raising their objections and their oppositions to what you've just said, and being able to address them, and sometimes you have to concede some of the opposite points of view maybe have validity. They may have merit. You're able to refute those that don't. And then you conclude, and that focus is emotional. Generally, in Cicero's argument and structure, it's pathos. You got them thinking that you are somebody important enough and reliable enough to listen to. They're nodding their heads. Okay, we'll listen to this guy. Then you tell them what the main work is, what the main argument is. And you're being so logical about it that they're nodding their heads and going, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. But you know what? They didn't take into account. And before I get a chance, you didn't take into account. You're already raising, oh, but you feel this way and this way. Well, let me just tell you, this is how we're going to address that. Now it's time to nail the coffin shut. Now it's time to get a call for action. Now it's time to appeal to their passions, if you will, emotionally. And the conclusion will be, hey, let's go out there and win one for the Gipper, or whatever it may be. Cicero's argument of structure, that may have been too much on Cicero and on rhetoric for you, but if you're interested in that kind of stuff, political speech making or otherwise, you might want to write your Roman legacy on Cicero. Virgil is somebody that you may have heard of. I have referenced him before. As you remember, Virgil wrote that epic entitled the Aeneid. Here's his work right here. And I also, as I suggested earlier in the lecture, that the Romans really respected the writing and the thoughts of the Greeks. And like Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Virgil took that story and turned it into something that was Roman. Because the Aeneid, the work, as I've suggested before, begins with Aeneas carrying his father out of burning Troy and ultimately going to Carthage with Queen Dido, leaving her to found Italy. And the Aeneid deals from that beginning, Aeneas leaving Troy, to Augustus Caesar. And if you look at Virgil's dates here, you'll recognize that indeed the empire, let's just say, began around here, 20 BCE. Octavius defeats Mark Antony, 31 BCE. Takes some time with to move from the Republic to empire. Let's just say that the imperial period, when Octavius becomes Augustus Caesar, first emperor of Rome, is about 20 BC. So Virgil is in that era and advocating for imperial Rome. And therefore the themes of the Aeneid are very nationalistic, to put it that, imperialistic. Rome is the great thing, and it's all about Rome. And so Aeneas' founding of Italy, and that ancestry and that heritage is really the push of the work, the theme of the work. It deals with fate. In other words, Rome was pre-designed, ordained by the gods to exist. And that starts to justify the Roman Empire on a somewhat propagandistic, in this case, literary level. Now, are there things that are contemporary to that? Or do we still have our own national myths, national patriotic kinds of stuff that, in a sense, gives us this sense of fate, of the gods on our side? Well, I can point to one in American history known as Manifest Destiny, that in a sense, Americans, it was their destiny that made now an actuality, manifested, that we should expand from the eastern coast to the western coast, and that this country is like God's country, and it was our destiny to take it over. Of course, Manifest Destiny didn't take into account the fact that they're going to murder, rape, and declare total war on Native American peoples. But that same sense is what Imperial Rome is, in a sense, doing with their literature. They are creating a sense of the empire as necessary, as fated. And their works, like the Aeneid, will deal with the theme of patriotism and of loyalty. Consider that Aeneas himself, the loyalty he has to his family, to his father as he carries him out of burning Rome, that kind of loyalty is infusing the Aeneid. All of it, in a sense, to declare that Augustus Caesar was fated to be Caesar, was chosen in that sense. As the Aeneid starts, as I said, from the burning of Troy to the reign of Augustus Caesar. So other themes that surface from this narrative, from this story about patriotism, the gods interacting, but they are, again, human. They're not the major players here, as you would have had in the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's more the human heroes. Piety and worship and respect, religious rituals and omens, all of these things are part of the Aeneid to suggest, again, loyalty to the state, loyalty to the emperor, loyalty to our customs, prayer, reverence for the state, reverence and respect for ancestors and the history and the heritage. And we create cultural myths very similar to that, national myths very similar to that, with our stories about George Washington, for example, and who chopped down a cherry tree and could not tell a lie, or Abraham Lincoln as Honest Abe, or many of these things that have created, if you will, the American mythology of rags to riches, log cabin to White House. In our contemporary times, in this late postmodern period, in this Generation Z moment, there's debunking of all that mythology. That all of these past heroes, in many ways, the ones in the respect for our ancestors in a national level, that was in a sense all a lie. And we're seeing all the cracks, and we're looking at, Woodrow Wilson was a racist, and we should not glorify what was going on in the South during the Civil War and tear down those monuments. So our period is really very much like what was the iconoclastic period, when they started tearing down the pagan monuments in the Christian era. We're tearing down our national heroes and all heroes. So respect for ancestors is a part of the Aeneid. And I think it would be an interesting idea to say, hey, are these themes still around today as well? So you're both looking at Virgil and his work in entirety. You're looking at one work in particular, in this case, the Aeneid. You're discovering these themes, and you're demonstrating, oh yeah, look, these themes are being brought out in Virgil's Aeneid in this way. But you might also then want to connect, what Virgil was doing way back then. Our writers, our historians, our philosophers, our newscasters, whatever you want to say, are still perpetuating or are destroying rather than perpetuating those kinds of myths. Interesting thing also, as I mentioned about the gods here, this idea of humanity. Regardless of the individual, and in a lot of ways, you have kind of this two-dimensional view of things of good people and bad people. Virgil is able to show us both in the good and in the bad, in a lot of ways the way Homer did, both qualities in an individual, which renders them as much more real, much more human. You might want to deal with Virgil if you don't want to deal with Cicero. There's Horace, and his major works are the art of poetry. And Horace will defend poetry. Remember, Plato banished the poets from the ideal republic because they incited negative emotions, let's say in the Guardians, who were supposed to protect and be stoic, induced passions and sorrow and pity, which we don't want. Well, Horace is going to respond to Plato and suggest, no, poetry is in itself is not wrong. It's just there's bad poets. There's great poets, and they should be allowed to be writing. But there are bad poets. And what are the bad poets? The ones that lead you to bad actions, or who give you bad examples or bad precepts. But the great poets give you great precepts. Thou shalt not. And in a delightful kind of way, in an entertaining and amusing way. Because Horace suggested we teach through delight. Anyone who has sat through a lecture like this one that might be tedious and boring and all of that recognizes, well, I'm not getting anything. But if you have a professor or a teacher who can make it a little bit more fun, a little bit more delightful, we tend to remember. So saith Horace. I'm hoping I'm not being too boring here. Some of his themes, Horace kind of removed himself from politics. He believed that, ambition, too much ambition, is just trauma. Too much career-oriented today. Too much running for the money or running for the status or whatever it is just produces nothing but turmoil and angst and anxiety and a troublesome life. One should be content with their position and not be running the rat race, if you will. Sometimes we all feel like moving away to an island where we can just kind of be ourselves and enjoy ourselves and not have to run this rat race. And Horace believed that indeed that was the idea. We should show gratitude for what we have. In times like now, during a pandemic, here I am inside a house, and I often just think about people who aren't. On top of all the stuff that's going on, they don't even have the basic needs. And there's a time when one should feel gratitude. Even when one has very, very little, one can always remember that probably somebody has less. So gratitude, satisfaction, pleasure, and ambitionlessness, not having ambitions, these produce turmoils. It's an interesting and almost existential idea. Avoidance of politics. Politics is a game, an art of rhetoric and persuasion, an art of splitting hairs, an art of trying to make the inferior argument appear to be the superior argument, regardless of which side you're on. Avoid that. Ethics. What is important is friendship, love, loyalty. Again, very Roman themes in that sense. He wrote what is sometimes termed as blame poetry, because Horace, even though he's talking about gratitude and satisfaction, is also one of these cynics. That school that looked at the old and said, these traditions, these customs, and they're all based on greed and corruption and all of that. And so rather than being a part of society in that way, I'd rather be myself in a natural environment setting, reclusive, whatever it may be. So he wrote critical and satirical studies on society and people based on that cynics, what we now have cynical point of view. He believed in that pleasure, not to excess, but that life's purpose was to sensuality and Epicurean. He writes, hopeful in adversity, cautious in success, is the heart well prepared for the opposite lot. Jupiter brings back the shapeless winters. He also takes them away. And not, if things go badly now, will it always be so. Sometimes Apollo wakes his silent muse with his cithara. He doesn't always stretch his bow. What's being said here in a nutshell is, you know, bad times will not last forever. Good times will not last forever. But during bad times, one should be hopeful about good times to come. And during good times, one should have the expectation that bad times will come. And note that these too shall pass. And he likens it to Apollo, as if the fate, the archer god. Apollo wakes his silent muse sometimes and plays not only the archer god, but also the god of music. Sometimes our day is going to be a good one. Apollo wakes up with his music and we're having a good day. He doesn't always wake up with an arrow, stretched his arrow to shoot you and have a bad day. So here we can see a kind of in the literature, this is what it's going to do. If I'm dealing with some of these themes, note this. Here's a poem I'm using as to suggest, oh, look at these themes of acceptance, of gratitude, of understanding there are good times and bad times, and enjoy them while you can. Hopeful in adversity. When you are in adverse situations, when times are difficult like they are right now, be hopeful. When you are successful, when times are good, be cautious, because they too will not last forever. But if you're cautious and hopeful in these opposite ends, the heart will be prepared for the opposite. If you're in good times and you're preparing for the bad times, when they come, you'll be prepared. Those kinds of things. You might like Horace. I was trying to kind of whet your appetites for that one. And therefore, you might want to look at his themes, one particular work by him, and show me how the themes are brought out in that work. And then you can link it, if you will, to contemporary times or make some statement, some conclusion along those lines. This one is Ovid. And so I think that this one might be the one that appeals the most to you. Ovid, as you can see, his dates, he was born 1 year before the assassination of Caesar, BCE, before the Christian era. And he died in the Christian era, what was usually then noted as AD, 17 AD. So 1 year before Caesar's death, and about, 12 years before the crucifixion of Jesus. That's Ovid's time period. And his major works are the Metamorphoses, and this literally translates to a transformation. We talk about, for example, from the caterpillar to the butterfly, that is a physical transformation, a metamorphosis. And the work, the Metamorphoses, deals with the Greek myths that I had mentioned before by Hesiod. All of those myths that you are kind of familiar with the Greek gods and the mortals, Adonis and whatnot. And the other major work is The Art of Love. And that one deals with this concept of love. It's kind of narrative, it's almost epic, and it even gives you kind of, it's a how-to court, make love, have a mistress, cheat, not cheat, all this kind of guidebook to the art of love. And quite scandalous, even in its time. In fact, Ovid was banished from the empire and tried to kind of get back into the good graces of the emperor. So the works are, the Metamorphoses, a collection of myths, and we've discussed some, but they all focus on transformation. And that's one of his major themes, transformation. And it's not just the transformation as we had seen in Hesiod, okay, why a flower has taken on this color because it's the blood of this individual. It's more about the transformation that is rooted in our entire existence, as suggested by many of those pre-Socratic philosophers. And for Ovid, obviously, change, transformation is the only constant. Sounds a lot like Heraclitus and Parmenides, those guys. So the stories are going to be even the transformations from the void, from the nothingness to the creation of the world, to the transformation into the human being, to destruction of all the earliest ages of man, because there was the golden age of man that then kind of denigrates into the bronze age of man, into the iron age of man, going down to the basic lead. And because of that, in this mythology, God sent the flood. The gods sent the flood to destroy all those earlier humankinds. And then we have the beginnings of a new transformation of humankind. Now that mythology should be reminiscent to you as well, because whether it's Gilgamesh and a flood, or it's Noah and a flood, Deucalion, in this case, the Greek, after the flood, so it's a transformation in that sense. And it leads even to deeper, more universal themes, our own continual transformation, not just evolutionarily speaking, but within oneself, the transformation from youth to age, a transformation from ignorance to knowledge, or whatever you want to say. So transformation. As noted about the art of love, love is also a major theme in Ovid. And remember, when I say theme, just love is a subject. Theme is what is Ovid suggesting about love? Well, often in his love stories, as in a sense to the Greeks, but this one a little bit more heightened, love does not always end well. In fact, often it ends kind of tragically. And one could almost say that he divorces the concept of love from the concept of sex. So for example, in the Greek myths, and therefore through Ovid in the Roman myths, when the Greek gods come down, when Apollo comes down, he comes to rape, violently abuse and abduct and take what he wants. And while there may be an obsession, a physical obsession in a story like Daphne and Apollo, where he's chasing the wood nymph, it's really just about the physicality. And of course, not only is Daphne physically resisting the god, she's running from him, but even the victims of these things, in this case the women, are also collaterally punished. So while revenge is exacted, for example, the god Apollo has come down to ravish the wood nymph, the mortal, not mortal, she's a demigod, Daphne. Daphne is running away from Apollo towards the riverbank where her father, a river god, is, who will then transform Daphne, the object of Apollo's great desire, into a laurel tree. So Apollo doesn't get what he wants. It's unrequited, but that was basically a physical and sexual thing. But what happens to Daphne? Is she rewarded for her chastity? Is she rewarded for her resistance? No, she's transformed into a tree. Oh my goodness, she too is punished collaterally for this victimization. And so you can see a very male-oriented kind of idea, but it doesn't have to be just basically gender-based, as much as power-based. Gods are powerful. Gods take. Gods ravish. Now, while we're seeing these myths coming out of Ovid in terms of sex divorced from love, whenever we really get a love motif, not sex, sex is avoided actually, not avoided in terms of action. They're reticent. They don't necessarily write about that. So I'm going to share at least one poem maybe that makes that point for you by Ovid. I have to switch out screens, so bear with me here as we go to this other screen in just a moment. Hi, everyone. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, let me know you're out there.
We are here.
Woohoo!
I'm here.
Woohoo! Hoping you can see here a document, Ovid's book. Can you see this? Book 1, LGV1, V?
Yes.
Okay, can we see that? Good. So this is from The Art of Love. It isn't from the Metamorphosis, the collection of myths and transformations. Just to make this point about the theme of love versus the theme of sex and violence. This is the one on love, Art of Love. He writes, it's called Corinna in an Afternoon. It was hot, and the noon hour had gone by. I was relaxed, limbs spread in the midst of the bed. One half of the window was open, the other closed. The light was just as it often is in the woods. It glimmered like Phoebus dying at twilight, or when night goes, but day has still not risen. Such a light as is offered to modest girls whose timid shyness hopes for a refuge. Behold, Corinna comes, hidden by her loose slip, scattered hair covering her white throat, like the famous Semiramis going to her bed. One might say Orlaeus, loved by many men. I pulled her slip away, not harming its thinness much, yet she still struggled to be covered by that slip. While she would struggle so, it was as if she could not win. Yielding, she was effortlessly conquered. When she stood before my eyes, the clothing set aside, there was never a flaw in all her body. What shoulders, what arms. I saw and touched. Breasts formed as if they were made for pressing. How flat the belly beneath the slender waist. What flanks, what form, what young thighs. Why recall each aspect? I saw nothing lacking praise. And I hugged her naked body against mine. I have to reset this thing up to get the last part. Oh, no, here it goes. Against mine. Who doesn't know the story? Weary, we both rested. May such afternoons often come for me. There's no doubt in the sensuality of the poem, in the erotic quality of the poem and the situation, but notice that all of it is done in almost that sensual rather than sexual way. She comes, the slip is loose, she resists, but she doesn't really want to resist. But at the point of, after all this, what that, with young thighs, I don't have to tell you everything about it. Everything was beautiful. I saw nothing lacking praised. So, and I hugged her naked body against mine. And then like an ellipsis, over. Who doesn't know the story? We all know what happens, right? We all can fill in those details. We're at the point where people are smoking cigarettes after the fact, sorry. Weary after it, we both rested. Beautiful afternoons, I hope a lot of them come. So again, when he's dealing with the mythology of sex, it's one thing, it's physical, it's violent. Victims are not, in a sense, saved. In fact, they too are seemingly punished. And it comes across with a different kind of theme. But when dealing with the more spiritual aspects of love, sex seems to be absent from the literature. So I'm going to switch screens back for just a moment. Hi again. To, where were we? Here. Okay. Now, transformation, change in all things in our natures, not only as an attempt to explain somehow or another why a flower was one thing or why it wasn't. Revenge issues, when people are, in a sense, if the gods are disrespected, remember going back to those other ideas of respect for the state, the emperor, your elders, the ancestors, society, law, all those things, any kind of violation of those things are met with a lot of punishment, very, very severe. So any sense of disloyalty in these stories by Ovid and betrayal are punished. A lot of that sexuality that we kind of talked about before, but the interesting thing is that sexuality there is in Ovid is not gender necessarily based. And so same gender, same sex relationships, all of these things, but the same universal principles apply of infidelity, betrayal, disloyalty, all those things. And in fact, gender itself is kind of addressed as, and not this kind of bi-gender way, kind of a little bit more contemporary, to tell you the truth. You may have seen, as you're going to write up about architecture and art, that one image of the hermaphrodite who has both male and female genitalia, sexual organs, that kind of crossbreeding. And you'll see in a lot of Greek, especially literature, a lot of this gender bending, if you want to call it that way, aspect of it, because it wasn't the way it was thought about for the most part in Puritan America. That had kind of come in much later, but it's a little bit more like, I think, the way we look at sexuality and gender today, not with, so many labels and 17 different kinds of genders and identifications, not necessarily like that, but it wasn't so, if you will, two-sided. So Ovid might be somebody that you might want to read about. You might want to take one of his works. I just showed you that one on Corina coming in, and focus on how some of the themes are there. Remember that, for example, love is also a transformative thing. It takes Apollo, who is the god in a lot of ways, the most reasonable god we've discussed, right? The god of social decorum. And what has he turned him into? Love or lust or attraction, the physical, for Daphne, is transformed him into a madman who is running off after a woman whom he ultimately does not get. And therefore he ends up like sitting alone and weeping tragically for the rest of his life. So love has a transformative effect. Love and often can lead to a sense of a desire for revenge. Sometimes in betrayal and disloyalty, there is an exacting of revenge. I take, for example, the story of Medea, who fell in love with the Greek hero, the Argonaut Jason. And Jason had married her and promised her all kinds of things, but he